Hello, you are listening to an archived worship service of First Presbyterian Church, Columbus, Mississippi. Thank you for listening.
Chapter 21 of John's Gospel is often called the epilogue. It's because John wraps up his Gospel pretty neatly. He says, I wrote these things down. There could have been a lot of other things that I wrote down, but if I put everything in here, the books would fill up the whole of the earth. The end. Oh yeah, so this other thing happened. John starts chapter 21 after he had already wrapped up the book. There's a lot of great books that do this that tell us just a little bit more of what happens. It's kind of like an artist coming back on stage saying, you want one more song? I'll give you one more song. John gives us this amazing view, this amazing narrative into the redemption of Peter. We cannot hear this story, as I was telling the children earlier, without first hearing those words that happened several weeks ago, that Good Friday narrative where Peter denies Jesus 3 times before the cock crows. We need that. One of the greatest gifts of the calling as minister, and also one of its hardest tasks, is to sit with a family who's experienced death. It is one of the greatest treasures of being a minister because you're there with people who are in the midst of a very traumatic time. And people meet that occasion differently. Each of us grieve differently, and so every single person, every single group, every single family meets that moment differently. And it is amazing to see. Some people are desperate. Some get really organized. Some talk a lot, and some are very quiet. But we all meet these moments of trial, these moments of hurt, these moments of difficulty in different ways. No two of these meetings are ever alike. But there is something that always comes up at some point. There's always this same kind of general summation that happens, maybe not in that first meeting, maybe not even after the funeral, but at some point, every single one of us goes back and says, I remember the last thing. I remember that last thing. Now, sometimes it goes like this. I remember the last time I talked to Dad. I remember the last time I saw my sister. I remember that last day with Brother. I remember the last words Mom said. Last things. They always come back. They always come up. I was reminded of that a week ago as I sat with the Williams family. After the sudden death of Becky, I sat with the boys. And the oldest son, Rollin, said, I remember the last thing I said to Mom. I told her I loved her. And it was in that moment that you could feel the grief in the room loosen just a bit. The other boys took comfort in that last thing. Now, sometimes the last things don't go that way. Sometimes they're not as happy as that last thing with Becky and Rollin. Sometimes the person recalls a fight or a difficulty or some kind of tension that was in the relationship before that day, and they remember that as the last thing. Sometimes there's even regret, things that were said, things that were left unsaid, and sometimes they say, oh, if I just had a second chance. If I just had different last things to share as the ending. Well, if the same human reaction were true for the great apostle Peter, he would have certainly fallen into the group with regret. Jesus' last words to Peter were to scold him there in the garden, a little bit like a child. Peter, put that sword away. You could imagine Jesus' voice, kind of like a parent's voice that can't believe they have to tell their child something again and in public. And then there's always Peter's last words concerning Jesus. What we talked about in the children's sermon, I don't know him. I don't know him. I don't know him. Peter's last time with Jesus was an absolute mess. It was the failure of discipleship, and it was a soul-crushing way to end. I don't blame him for leaving Jerusalem. All the physical reminders of his failure. So he travels back north to his home, to Galilee, to Capernaum, to that small fishing village where Jesus had first found him, along the shore of the small sea where there's a small boat that he left behind years ago, where he had dropped his nets to follow Jesus. Well, he's returned to pick them back up. If he couldn't follow Jesus, he would return home. If only he could go home again. If he could find a way to leave it all behind, to go back to the way things were. For Peter, I imagine home means safety. The familiarity and the routine would help Peter forget about the broken place in life. He says, I'm going fishing. His friends say, not by yourself, you're not. But a fruitless night comes to an end, and something new comes in the morning. There's a shout from the shore, and there's a vision of Christ. Once again, Peter tried to walk on the water. That's the only reason I can understand that he would put clothes on before jumping in. He was desperate for his second chance. He was desperate to give a new ending to the last thing. So at the Lord's breakfast, he is restored. It is there when Jesus breaks the bread and serves the fish that he finds reconciliation and he finds new purpose. There is the threefold return, a reminder that he is no longer a fisherman, a reminder that it's time to go. Jesus offers a world that is changed by Easter, and he says, you can't go home again. This home is no longer yours. Your calling is elsewhere. There is a land larger than this. There is a calling bigger for you. Peter's new commission is not deterred now by last things. His love for Christ will find an expression in his love for Jesus' own flock. He, among many, many others, will create a community unafraid of these last things. good or bad, because these last things are never last when we live into Easter. Peter, Paul, John, countless others will help understand better a world where last things are never, ever truly last. Christ has restored Peter to a new purpose and gives him new life to follow. And many years ago, the author Thomas Wolfe penned a book by the same name as this sermon title. You Can't Go Home Again. In fact, he actually published this after his death. It was compiled by an editor of other works that he had left unfinished. In his book, there is a character, George Weber. And George is an author, and he has written this book that people love, they can't get enough of. It's set in the time of the Great Depression, and he tells a story about all the people from his hometown. The problem is the people in his hometown hate it, and they hate him for it. In fact, they send him death threats. And he can't go home again. In the night, George Weber hears a voice, he says. In the night, he hears what might be some part of redemption for him. And he attributes it to death. He says, "Something has spoken to me in the night and told me that I shall die. I do not know when or where. Death is to loose the bonds of earth. To lose the things you know for a greater knowing. To lose your life for a greater life. To leave the friends you've loved for a greater loving. To find a land more kind than home, more large than earth." In George's imagination, the only thing that can restore the brokenness of his relationships is death. It is a desperation that tells you last things are truly last things. It's the only way he sees out of this mess he has created. I wonder if Peter heard voices like that that said, "You've messed up too big. There's no way out of this one. Too far gone. Jesus said you would deny him 3 times before the cock crowed, and you did." I wonder if he heard a voice that he attributed to death, beckoning him. How many times have we heard that voice? When things look too far gone. When a relationship is too broken to mend. When the last thing was too devastating to live through. How many times have we been in George's shoes? We said the only way out of this is death. I imagine more of us have been to that place than will admit. Peter goes back home. He goes fishing. He's looking for something. Anything. But he doesn't find death. Life finds him. Life finds Peter on the side of that small sea, fishing from that small boat, picking up that same old net that he'd always picked up. Life finds Peter and restores him. You see, when we are Easter people, those whispers of death are not the last word. When we're Easter people, those voices we hear long into the night are not the strongest voices we hear. Those fruitless nights of casting our nets time and time and time again, that's not how our story ends. Jesus proves here that any relationship can be mended. There is reconciliation in every breath of life. There is hope in each heartbeat. Jesus restores Peter, even Peter, and teaches him that these things you thought were last are never last again. Because Easter has changed everything. When that tomb was opened, it changed everything. When Jesus was found among the living and not among the dead, it changed everything. And it changes us. And it changes our brokenness. And it changes our failures. And it changes our dread. And it changes our death. After that, we know no bonds of death. So whether it's home or away, whatever our calling is to, those broken places are no longer broken. They need not stay that way. Those places which we retreat from, they can be mended. And on our own, this brokenness cannot be mended, but in Christ it can be, if George Weber could feel that and find that hope. Something has spoken to me. In the rising of the sun, in the new morning that dawns, and it told me that though I may die, I do not die as one without hope. I die as one who has great hope. So if I live or if I die unto the Lord. Easter brings life to all things, even those things we are running away from. So I invite you to find Easter hope. Find Easter joy. Find Easter courage. Find the meal ready to nourish you and your soul and the calling. Jesus does not restore Peter without giving him purpose. To love greater, to live greater, to know greater, because there is a larger creation. Jesus says, "Follow me." Amen.